I have a quote right at the beginning. We're talking about Nietzsche, and one remarkable quote from the Twilight Zone is never make equal what is unequal. So, the interest in inequality that pervades his work. So, a little introduction about the man we are talking about. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, was born in Röcken, which is in Saxony-Anhalt. And the house where he was born still exists, unchanged practically. And he was born to a family where the father was a Lutheran minister. And very early on, he showed sign of exceptional, quick intelligence. He spent some years at the University of Bonn, and then was called in the area of classical philology, Greek and Latin, and then was called by the University of Basel in Switzerland to be the chair of the Department of Classical Philology. Now imagine that Nietzsche was only 24 years old when that happened. It was a record. Nobody in Germany at that time came anywhere near close to be so young and yet so famous already. And Nietzsche wrote in Basel The Birth of Tragedy. Still one of the most popular books around. On undergraduate schools in the US, you always find departments that still teach that book. So it's the most popular book of Nietzsche. But very soon it showed itself that Nietzsche didn't have the health. He was very sickly. He came also from a family that had a long history of diseases, including insanity episodes. So he carried around a considerable load of should I say, traits that he took over from the larger family. So he had to leave the university. He started to freelance. By that time he had switched to philosophy. And the University of Basel gave him a modest stipend for a lifetime, actually, that he could exist on. And in order to take care of his fragile health, he spent the summers in the Swiss Alps, in Sils Maria, near St. Moritz. There still is a Nietzsche house there, wonderful house. And in the summer, he liked to go to the French and Italian Riviera. So he wrote incredibly many books. And that's almost the only thing he actually did. Writing and writing, and we will come back to see how that is significant for him. So he wrote for a total of about 46 years, and then he fell into insanity himself. Spent the last 11 years, a little bit over 11 years, in the night of insanity. His mother took care of him first, and afterwards his sister. So that's more or less his life. And when we now go and examine a little bit some of his writings, we have to make sure that we're only selecting a very small section of his incredible work. Nietzsche is probably in modern times the most commented philosopher that we have, almost next to Plato. It's incredible how the interest that he evoked. And you will see today, hopefully, we'll realize why that is so. So when it comes to the questions that we want to ask today, we return back to what we originally asking all of these philosophers, and that is, what does it mean to be truly human? What for you is the ideal definition, if there is one, of a human being? And fortunately for us, he actually formulated that question himself. So it looks relatively easy You can expect that he himself answered that question, and we'll see how he goes about it. How did he go about it? In 3 months before his falling into insanity, he published his last book and gave it the title of Ecce Homo. Now, Ecce Homo is Latin for behold the man. And what it evokes in Latin is the picture of Jesus. Pilate had scourged him. The soldiers had given him a crown of thorns and have clothed him in a kind of purple cloak, and then showed him in this fashion to the Jewish authorities, hoping to convince them this man is totally innocent. Now, for Nietzsche, the reason why he wrote that Ecce Homo, he gave that book Ecce Homo the title, is that the crucified was really the anti-picture that he himself wanted to elaborate, namely in the form of the Übermensch. So you have here, right in the title, a juxtaposition of a very, what he considered to be negative life attitude, symbolized by the Christ practically near to death and bleeding all over, and on the other hand, the strong overman that he wanted to represent. So it's him against the crucified. That also shows you the lifelong contest and tension that he had between the morality of Christianity, which he found absurd, and his own immoralism that he wanted to create as the ever new morality that created within the will to power the ideal individual. The subtitle of that book, Ecce Homo, there we find that formula, how one becomes what one is. So you would think this is relatively easy to answer. But let me go, and before I go a little bit more into it, let me go into some of the main goals that he had with his philosophizing. When he was relatively young, even at the beginning years of Basel, he dreamt of a culture that was divided into two ranks, two castes, so to speak. One was the high culture. This was the culture of the creative individual. These were individuals outstanding that were capable of imposing their view and their vista on the rest of the culture. It was magnificent, the language he uses in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the language he uses to portray that individual. On the other hand, there was another culture, and it was a lower culture, actually a base culture, a culture that was practically asleep. And it was the culture of the then Germany and Europe altogether. And that culture was low because it didn't create really, it didn't transform and create new values. They shepherded old values. That was all they did. Whether they in whatever branch of the society they were practically asleep. And this lower culture was then called a herd morality, a morality of sheep that were practically asleep. And so the relationship between the higher culture and the lower culture was such that the lower culture really was supposed to serve the higher culture in order to make it possible for the higher culture to have the leisure to create new ideas and be on top of society. This kind of aristocracy, sometimes by scholars called radical aristocracy, doesn't fall into any kind of model that you would have historically about the aristocratic thinking, the aristocratic idea. It was a completely different aristocracy because the aristocracy was uniquely a kind of the battle of the giants of the mind. And so for me, I always ask myself, why for Nietzsche, he didn't refer to science as just an incredible way of leaving a mark on this universe. To tell the truth, Nietzsche had no inkling what science was all about. Number two, he had no interest in science. And for some time I asked myself, well, how can he miss that? Especially 10 years after his death. Charles Darwin came out, The Origin of the Species, introducing a revolutionary theory that really changed in many ways the way we think about anything today. So I couldn't put the two things together, and I said, what is lacking here? Why did he do that? Until I realized that this was not at all what he was after. He was not after people who would commandeer the world in a scientific endeavor. He was after self-transformation, self-creation. So that puts the whole outlook, all of a sudden, of Nietzsche back to the individual, the glorified individual that he wanted to champion, and not only to champion, but practically to demonstrate in his own person. So therefore we have in the scholarship of Nietzsche absolutely nothing of a scientific nature that you could say no relationship, because it never come up. But on the other hand, Nietzsche then fell into the camp of the existentialists, because all of a sudden people in phenomenology and existentialism, they got very interested in how he doubted the subject, how he tried to recreate new values, anti-establishment values, going beyond the present moment and so on. And so on. And so that is sort of this very strange solution that people had to accept, that he didn't consciously reject science. He just had no interest in it, nor did he know what science was all about. So that shifts our discussion tonight also more on the level of existence. The truly human being turns out to be a being that is constantly reshaping, superseding himself in new creation. And we will talk in a moment a little bit more about it. What I want to say next is that when you look at this aphorism of how one becomes what one is, there is a popular misconception about what that means. And I want to get it out of the way, because what I'm going to tell you, this is not what he had in mind. It looks like, when you look at the formula, that there is inside of us a potential that is waiting to be developed and to be explored. So how one becomes what one is seems to say, look, you have a lot of talent, you have unexplored side of you. Why don't you take up music to see whether you have really a musical interest? And then you see what you already are is then furtherly developed. This is the kind of conception that Aristotle had of developing what one was. And as you recall, Plato had it too. Then he gave this, Socrates said, in terms of the individual, that the individual had already every information he wanted inside himself, and so it was merely a matter of developing. So if you go skiing, all of a sudden you realize you have talent for skiing, or if you, all these different talents that you have to come out. And education was increasingly seen as tapping into the potential and realizing the potential of a person. That's very popular thinking now also. Realize your potential, make something that you already are, but develop it further. So that is clearly not what he meant by how one becomes what one is. So what did he mean? And in order to that question, in order to answer that question, we have to proceed to my first topic, which is that the self for Nietzsche was a fiction. But before I go into that topic, is there anything on your mind that you would like to ask now, so far discussed about the man we are talking about today?
I have a question. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Chris, just one question, because referring to your final point, and we take you as an example. So let's imagine we are interested in the true Eugen, who really finds his self. Would you rather say then, well, I'm interested in the continuation of your argument, that you will find different Eugens and none of these is the true one? All of them are true, and in a way, in the course of your life, you can choose which Eugen you make big.
I would say that of myself, yeah. I haven't figured out yet who I am, first of all. But if I had to say, if you ask me, who I am, I would say, well, I'm many things, depending, I need some context for that question. And interesting what you say, because Nietzsche had the same notion of the self being a multiplicity. He called it perspectivism. And that is that, first of all, he thought everything was just interpretation. And so, but he had to somehow come around and say, what do you mean everything is interpretation? And he said, yeah, everything is interpretation. There are no facts that are free from interpretation. And if everything is interpretation, then you have to ask, well, are there good interpretations or bad interpretations? And there he would say, yes, there are better interpretations than others, but again, I need a context for that. And so in that sense, he looks very much like Wittgenstein, who also solved Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, who also thought, well, if you ask me who I am, you have to look at what I'm doing. I'm building a house, good, okay. So what else do you need? Okay, no, I'm creating a stadium, etc. Behind those different activities, there is no unified self. And so, fortunately, you have really anticipated a very important segment that we are going to...
I would agree with both of them, Wittgenstein and Nietzsche, because it also depends on who's asking the question.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And, it's interesting that when he brings up the why we need a subject at all, he has an excellent example that might interest you. He uses the expression, it rains. And he asks the reader, what do we mean by it? Who is doing the raining? Well, nobody's doing the raining. It just rains. But because our language forces us to think in subject, predicate kind of construction, we need a phantom subject, I would call it, a purely imaginary subject. It rains. But all really you see out there, hopefully a little bit more than we got today, but it's raining, nothing else. It's just raining. There's no subject there that actually, although there are lots of pictures you could imagine how somebody empties those clouds above there. So he drew the analogy with a sentence that could be called, I am walking. Okay, I am walking. Well, he says, the reason we say I am walking is really only our grammar that requires a subject to the walking. Pretty much like it rains. So I am walking, really what he means is walking happens. Walking. It's walking. You don't need a subject behind it, etc. Which means that the self in question is a sum total of activities. You could say, in a way, that the self is a verb not a noun. And so when you think of grammar again, and you think of the noun usually refers to a thing. So when you say I, the pronoun I, as a noun, you expect that to refer to a thing. But that is just again for Nietzsche an imposition of grammar. And for him, when he says the self is a fiction, he means very concretely a textual fiction. He means literature. He means going out there in the large arena of what has been written about the human species over the last 5,000 years. He has reviewed them. I remind you, he was a classicist, enormous amount of knowledge. And he looks at all that literature and he searches for examples that really he could espouse as pictures of the ideal individual he had in mind. An individual who always overcomes himself to find a better version of himself, and thus belongs to the higher culture and can transform the culture in which he lives. So he looks at that literature and he finds it. It's very interesting. When I was teaching Plato in the 80s at college, I welcomed a book that was published in 1985 by a professor from Princeton University. His name is Alexander Nehamas. And he came out with a book with the title Nietzsche, Life as Literature. It was a tremendous book and still is. It's incredible. I mean, after 35 years, if you ask any scholar on Nietzsche what the most important book there is on Nietzsche, it's very likely that he or she will tell you it's Alexander Nehamas' book. And in this book, he shows that what Nietzsche did when he thought of the individual that overcame himself constantly, what he did is exactly go back to literature and find in literature those characters on the authors that inspired him. I'll give you a few examples. Okay, first of all, we return to the answer that the self is not a substance. The self is a literary invention. We use it, we need it in order to talk, because grammar is constituted that way, but we don't need to believe in grammar. We have to develop our thought the way we invent it, because the self-creation is an invention. And that is exactly what the novelist is doing. That is exactly what great individuals are doing. They're creating characters. One of the authors that Nietzsche loved was Dostoevsky. So if you take the brother Karamazov in Karamazov, you ask yourself, one of the brothers, for instance, Fyodor Karamazov, if you look at the character, you have to accept the character as it is in its totality, in its weakness, his cruelty, his good sides, everything that makes that character the character it is. And that gave Nietzsche the idea that if you talk about the ideal human being, you really have to include everything. The good, the evil he did, he may have been cruel, he may have been a criminal, whatever. But normally it's a whole package. It's the whole deal. And normally there is something in there, in that character, like I said, for instance, Madame Bovary by Flaubert. There's something in that character that really entices you, at least it did Nietzsche, in terms of how they imposed who they were. Now remember, they were literary creations, but as a character, they imposed who they were on the environment, with all the tragedy that could result from there. So, for me, that was an enormously important book, and because it put Nietzsche where he actually belongs. He belongs in literature. And it's not literature just so for the connoisseurs. Literature was a way of life. So there you have that existentialist notion. He couldn't read anything without thinking, how can I apply that to myself? How does that look in my life? And so even the book that we are discussing here, Ecce Homo, it's riddled with all the books he ever wrote, all the books he ever read, and I am the sum total of what I have read. But the question is, what does that mean to be the sum total? And now he goes into some specifics. First of all, there is the self conceived as a literary character. And that is, like I gave the example with Karamazov, that entices admiration in Nietzsche, and he looks for other models that he could, and he finds them, to the hundred, so to speak. And he develops then, he looks that model, and he sort of, on that notion, he starts creating his own fiction of who he possibly could become, how one becomes what one is. But this becoming is very interesting because the becoming is then that he takes these texts as practically containing who he was himself. So you remember perhaps a time when, at least I had it when I was an adolescent, I went into a movie theater, and coming out for at least 2 or 3 hours, I was the character of the movie, and it had that effect. Or in modern times, I sometimes talk to my students and I say, look, this lyric, let's say the Beatles, Let It Be, this is me, let it be. And for them, certain lyrics have become life-determining because this is really who they are. Now, Let It Be is not really a good song for Nietzsche because he really doesn't want to let it be. He wants to change it totally, so he probably wouldn't have thought highly of that particular lyric. But I just want to give an example how that can work. So on the one hand, we have the literary character. On the other hand, we have the individual novelist who does that creation. And he too can be a model of Nietzsche. The person he liked most as the dream come true of what he had in mind is Goethe. And you ask yourself, why Goethe? Well, again, Goethe had the talent of incorporating in himself all these different perspectives and never stopped reinventing himself in those things and creating an impact on the German public that was of a lasting nature. So Goethe is the all-time paradigm of the subject as a fiction, as an author of a fiction, but also as exemplifying that activity in his own self. Other examples would be Spinoza. He liked Spinoza a lot, or Julius Caesar. I mean, these are all people that sort of emulate the spirit of what it means to go beyond at all times of what you have created. Napoleon was interesting hero of his. I say interesting because he admired Napoleon for a perfect example of imposing the will to power on an entire nation, or even over Europe as a whole. But he himself, Nietzsche, was against the French Revolution. And the reason he was against the French Revolution is that there was a lot of bloodshedding. He couldn't stand the bloodshedding. He was against violence. It's very surprising. I will come later to speak a little bit more about what it means to deal with cruelty examples that Nietzsche sometimes gives of the Übermensch, etc. But the activity now of dealing with the self-creation, Nietzsche has some very specific advice to give how you can do that. So first of all, you have to accept yourself as you are at this particular present moment. And we will see later on how that is done. There is a test that you can undergo according to Nietzsche, whether you are able to accept yourself really. I'm going into that later. For the moment, I just want to say that what Nietzsche did when he advocated surpassing yourself, the word über, the beyond, over, etc. Das Übermenschliche. When he thought about this, he thought that we all should review our values and replace the negative values with positive ones. I'll give you an example. Now, negative values are values that are life-negating. All right? They are the weak side of your psyche. Positive values are values that make you strong, that looks for the fight to establish yourself as the one that can overcome crises and all sorts of obstacles. The example is that, for instance, you might find in yourself that you have certain properties of a coward. There are certain elements in your life that have to do with cowardice. Now, cowardice is very negative kind of for Nietzsche, to be a coward. You don't want to be a coward. So what you do in the re-evaluation of your values, because this is what the Übermensch is all about, as you re-evaluate your values, you definitely want to replace being a coward with, for instance, having courage. And then you go around and exercise that. You make that concept very powerful. And this is how you then transform the culture. So you review you accept yourself, who you are. You look at all these different sides and you ask yourself, how could I develop in the kind of individual I'm dreaming about? And the individual Nietzsche is dreaming about is the individual that has power and can impose power on the public individually to himself. Now it turns out that when you do that, you're also shaping the culture you're in. And that was a big goal, especially of the early Nietzsche. He thought that by demonstrating how he could self-create himself, that he would find other people who in their own way, not in the way Nietzsche is proceeding, would be powerful and link up to that higher culture that he was aspiring to. And so the criterion, if you look at the Nietzsche, what he thought, what the measuring stick into those values inside of you that are to be replaced by positive values, the measuring stick is the difference between life and death affirming and life negating. So anything that affirms life in its fullness, in its beauty, in its cruelty, in its vitality, in ways we haven't even found out yet. They're still to be found out. because we are surpassing in our creating moods always into new values. So on the one hand, this ideal of life-affirming values are juxtaposed with the life-negating values. These are values that make you look weak. There are values that make of you a hypocrite in whatever you are doing. Values of rationalization, values of how you can express. These pretty much, it comes down to the values of Christianity. He thought the values of Christianity was really an immorality in itself, insofar as it replaced honesty with a big lie in order to keep the people pacified. So what we are dealing now is an effort by the individual that Nietzsche is aspiring to, in terms of seeing through the self-negating moralities of his time. And seeing through it, he juxtaposed hypocrisy and honesty. In order to understand that, we again have to see how, especially in his book, Genealogy of Morals, he converted everything in that book into its opposite. For instance, he said, well, altruism is really a form of egoism. Why? Precisely because you get a high by being altruistic. You forget about that this is all about you. And so you are rejecting part of you, which is that you are really want the will to power. Yeah, but you are presenting yourself as an altruist, but presenting yourself as an altruist really is the one that gives you power. So it's a strange re-evaluation of all values. And it does the same thing with other ideals that you might have, or that, for instance, Christianity recommends. For instance, Christianity recommends that you do service to the other, a wonderful feature of service. But Nietzsche turns it around again. Yes, yeah, don't forget you are doing that nice things only to get a high out of it. This is really about you again, because ultimately you have the greatest satisfaction. Whether it's in your mind and your consciousness as a sacrifice, something you renounce in order to give to the other people, it is a disguise. So this kind of re-evaluation characterizes the fiction that the self is. And the question that we are having is, what are good fictions? What are these better fictions? And what are these more negative fiction? And how does Nietzsche find them? How does he really find a life-affirming morality? What is it at the bottom? So I want to stop again, because I now make a transition from the life as a fiction to our next topic that might be called the eternal recurrence of the same. So is there any question on your mind that you would like to ask me about this self as an imaginary fiction, as the potential of creating new values for you?
Again, you referred several times to literature and, let's say, also the relationship between philosophy and literature. And as you probably know, among philosophers, Nietzsche is often not considered to be a philosopher himself. And I would be interested in hearing from you how you consider this particular style of writing, which Nietzsche, of course, applies to many subjects in his writings, and also how he looks at the burden of culture. You see, if you look at various of his writings, he's always referring to the burden of history which prevents you from being a heroic individual. If you look at vom Nutzen und Nachteil der Geschichte für das Leben, etc. So there are lots of these kind of things where he is referring to culture, literature, and, well, all of our Central European kind of heritage, which is really preventing us from developing our strong self or inner self.
Yeah, that's a very huge question. I want to address the first point you raised first, and that is, whatever Nietzsche is doing with his writings is that philosophy. And the answer to that might be yes, but it is a philosophy that, at least in the West, nobody is acquainted with. Why? It justifies life aesthetically. What does that mean? It means that life is basically a work of art. And the so-called Übermensch is the individual who can create those work of arts. And guess which one is the primary work of art that he creates? It is himself. So that's a kind of philosophy that comes to some extent very close to Socrates. On the other hand, Nietzsche, in his ambivalent attitude to Socrates, hated Socrates because he thought Socrates was a hypocrite. He had already contained all the answers, etc. Whereas the individual who considers the life as a work of art doesn't know any kind of answer. They really has to create the basic values of what it means to be alive, etc., in the first place. So what happens here with Nietzsche? First of all, there is a segment of the scholarly literature on Nietzsche that detects an Eastern element in his philosophizing. Why? Because for the East, the work of art is a way of being. And when they interpret their scriptures, they often interpret them mere in aesthetic, because aestheticism became ontology. So it was not, again, the substance-oriented kind of philosophy, concepts, explaining concepts and applying those concepts. His ideal philosopher of the whole bunch of Western philosophers was Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's idea. Why? Schopenhauer, as educator, he had created himself in his work, The World as Will and Representation. He had created himself out of his willing, and he interpreted the philosophizing as the pure act of willing. And if you fill that in, the character of willing, what does he will? He wills the new element that would give him the power to reinvent himself. So in order to move to the second part of your question, it's important to realize that Nietzsche thought that he was about 200 years ahead of his contemporaries. There are quite a few expressions in his writings that he is untimely in a sense, because his own time is so steeped in the values that at one time may have had values, but since then had become the values of the herd, the values of just continued mindlessly, etc., whatever they were about to do. And did I answer your question, or I feel there are some more questions that you were asking, Wilhelm?
Yes, but as you mentioned, just the unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen,
Yeah.
among which this one about history is one of them, they are typical for his attitude, which of course is one that also reflects on the burden of the so-called Abendland or the European culture on, let's say, shrinking the capacity of the individual. And he's trying to, of course, argue against that very strongly.
Yes, and this ties in with a kind of imagery he had of that burden. It was gravity. It was Schwerfälligkeit, die Schwere dieser Bürde und so weiter. And he juxtaposed the lightness, the Leichtigkeit, the lightness of his own philosophizing style, etc. Because you're absolutely right. There was something that he saw in those old style philosophies that put the burden down, and you were sort of almost held prisoners by that, etc. And on the other hand, by shaking it all off and advocating the spirit of lightness, of fire, of passion, of future, of openness, etc., he believed that he was escaping that gravity, the spirit of gravity. Although his historical reflections are a pleasure to read, because most of them are wrong in my opinion, and are already directed, but they clearly bring out that aspect of Nietzsche that has to do with how he conceived about his own work.
But why don't you continue? Because I think what you just brought out is something that fascinated generations of German writers, particularly also in the first half of the 20th century.
Yes, absolutely. And you really have to wait until Alexander Nehammer's book to find a totally different orientation in there. Very interesting. Now, that book by Nehammer's is often criticized for aestheticizing Nietzsche again. See, of doing away with what some earlier interpreter was thinking about, brutal kind of outbursts of violence and whatnot. All of a sudden, here comes that incredible book by Nehammer, and it shifts the entire orientation of Nietzsche's scholars towards the self-creation, towards the literary nature, the aesthetic nature. And it sort of catches up with Nietzsche's sentence that life could only be justified aesthetically. So what does that mean, be justified aesthetically? It means that it's justified by the kind of self-creation you are able to reach in this attempt of superseding yourself. That is meant by aesthetically. You are making yourself into a work of life. Now that kind of philosophy, the philosophy that you are, the philosophy is not just some opinions you have. The philosophy is who you are. Now, how one becomes who you are, that is still something we have to find out. And but I'm going on to the next segment. The next segment deals with the eternal recurrence of the same. Why? Because it will allow you, this doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same, it will allow you to get a measure on what life-affirming and life-negating moralities are. So we have to find out what it means. What does eternal recurrence of the same means? Number one, it is a cosmological idea. The idea is relatively simply put. A beautiful scene in the book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra stands below a doorway, and he says to the dwarf at his side, Now look at this world. One direction of history goes back into infinity. The other goes forward into infinity. Now, if you are capable, he tells that dwarf, if you are capable of comprehending what infinity really means, you realize that the world has no purpose. So, in other words, he says that if anyone understands the infinity of the world, namely that it never began and will never end, he has to come to the conclusion that if the world would have a purpose, it had reached it. I mean, this is what infinity means. And so he concluded from that fact in the cosmological perspective that since the world, the infinite world expands, has no beginning and no end, we are doing the same old all over again. There's no other possibility of interpreting than that you are just doing what everybody else always did, etc. Now, this hypothesis of the eternal recurrence as a cosmology is rejected by all philosophers, on Nietzsche, everybody. I mean, they cannot see any kind of how it could be proven. And what is more interesting is also that Nietzsche really never used it. He wasn't interested in this cosmological perspective. He was interested in something else. And that's now it becomes interesting. He was interested in the psychological aspect of the eternal recurrence. What is that? The psychological aspect is based on the first hypothesis that everybody in the universe, every single element is connected to every other element in the universe. It's one fit. It's nowadays called the butterfly effect, and which means that if a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere in Hawaii, a typhoon is created in Shanghai. I mean, it's sort of this kind of non-linear connectedness that quantum physics has brought to the fore. The butterfly effect, many scientists now, at least on the level of, let's say, quantum mechanics, is respectable. I mean, it can be used in a variety of ways that are, first of all, scientific and also beneficial. But for Nietzsche, again, he then says, well, if everything is connected to everything else in the universe, you cannot really take one element out of it without altering the entire universe. And then he immediately went to he went forward and created a test for human life. He said, look, if you look back on your entire life, this is now a thought experiment. This is not anymore, how should I say, a physical theory. Nietzsche has changed the picture now. He moves towards a thought experiment, and he asks himself, if you look back at your life right now, whoever you are, and ask yourself the question, would I change anything in that life? And your answer is yes. You have to think again. You may have lived the wrong life. Why? Because for the butterfly effect to obtain in your case as an individual, every single element that you have gone through, all the tragedies, the evil, even the crimes that you committed or whatever, that belongs to you. Now, as of now, are you able to accept that? If you are able to accept that, then at least you are already a certain advantage of what life-affirming morality might look at, etc. So that's a thought experiment. And so if you say yes, I would change. You're already on the wrong side now. We have to look how we can, how your insight has to improve in such a way that before you really reach the level of really accepting everything in your life, you cannot proceed. So now becomes a moral imperative. Live your life so as to become able to welcome its eternal recurrence. That doesn't mean that you now say it occurs eternally. It just means it's a principle of the kind of morality that he is steering toward. And the morality is called that eternal recurrence is a test to see whether you are able to accept life in every dimension, or whether you are switching around, trying to repair this and that, and therefore being selective and coming up with all sorts of shortcomings. That also means, I'm just realizing that we are reaching the end of our lesson, but of our conversation. But it also means that everything you do is of equal value. That's also whether you wash your hands now that we are so many times obliged to wash our hands, or whether you have the greatest philosophical idea you ever had, etc. They all belong to one piece. And so that sort of does away into sort of separating elements of the self-transformation into elements that are of importance, other less important, etc. It creates life as a whole package. And the beginning to become who you are, it begins, the first step is that first of all, you learn to accept who you are. And who you are, the test for it is whether you would be willing, if you would call to life again, whether you would be willing to live the whole life again exactly as you lived it, or whether you would change it. So I stop here again because now that we have this entry into what it means to, should I say, discover a holy, life-affirming morality, we are now going into an area, and we have to do that next time. And how does one exercise this life-affirming morality? And the answer will be famous answer, and most important answer will be the will to power. And so we will maybe start next time with this topic of the will to power. So do you have a question regarding the return of the same, eternal recurrence? Did that make sense to you, what I explained about Nietzsche?
Yeah, thank you, Eugen. Thank you very much again for tonight. And I actually do have a question which is more general. So,
yeah.
In the beginning, you talked about creating a better version of oneself.
Right.
And I think we are all influenced by society, by friends, by family, by our business surrounding. And you talked a lot about life-affirming values, about honesty. But I would like to know, in your opinion, what is a better version of oneself? Because I'm struggling with the word better, because it's always subjective.
Yeah, that's a great question again. I think the better version of yourself is just around the corner. And this is the one that is superseding who you are at this moment. You don't know what it's going to be. 1,000 factors will be involved. A multiplicity of factors that will all have a bearing on you will be. But what is very important is that you go that path, leave your old values behind and go into those new values. That creates an enormous inner tension, because some of your old values are still good and others are less good, but you have to go forward. You cannot just say what the ideal would be of your ideal self. That is too static. That is precisely this kind of thinking that he wanted to avoid. That you arrive at a Weltanschauung, so to speak, where everything is in order. You're still not there, but you're trying to reach that level and become better and better according to the morality that you have figured out by yourself. So the answer to your question, the way I read Nietzsche, is the attempt to create yourself anew in such a way that your power increases in impinging its impact of the world. Everything, we will find out next time, everything is about impacting the world through the power, etc. But again, this kind of power is mostly the power of a great idea. It's the power of a work of art. It's the power of, how should I say, of seeing the entire universe and living the entire universe in a new way. Philosophy is a way of being that has to figure out from moment to moment and sort of refers back a little. What kind of philosophy is this? I mean, certainly not the philosophy that we are acquainted with. Philosophy as a way of being, philosophy as creating your life into a work of art that is always becoming. And about that becoming, how that happens, we will find next time when we talk about the will to power, because that's what he means by becoming, to exercise the will to power. So it was really a pleasure again to, was it a lot of fun for you too?
It was a pleasure for all of us, I think. Thank you very much, Eugen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of questions, but next time.
Oh, next time, yeah, I'm willing, you know, that's really all about questions. So I have a lot of questions myself, so thanks for coming.